Haris ke Irini, and welcome back to Paul's letter to the Romans. I am David, and I'm excited for today's episode because we are finally getting into the first major topic, and the tone of our little podcast here is actually going to finally get into groove because starting today, we're going to get into actual multi-chapter long arguments, and so we're going to have an actual train of thought to follow. And I think starting this episode, things get really, really interesting. And people tend to really enjoy finally being able to connect the dots across such long passages. So I'm excited to get into it with you today. In the previous episode, we talked about the transitional verses. That's chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And they transitioned the first 15 verses, which are the introductory material. That is, the author identified himself, the addressees are identified, there's the prayer and thanksgiving. All of that is transitioning in verses 16 and 17 to the first topic, which we start covering today. That's what we did last time. In today's episode, we'll finally get into the first piece of Paul's argument, which is going to span chapter 1, verse 18, all the way to the end of chapter 8. And so I'll call this an 8-chapter long discussion, and it's all about the gospel. Remember, Paul is ultimately trying to get to Spain, and he wants Roman support, but he doesn't know the Romans personally. He's never visited face to face. And so he feels that if he's going to get the support from these people, these believers, that he needs to address all the controversies and all the accusations that have come about because of his ministry. So he does this deep dive into what the gospel is to show that they are on the same page. And if they're on the same page, they'll buy into his ministry and help him spiritually and probably also financially. The topic of the gospel, as it spans these 8 chapters, can be divided into a handful of points. The first one is going to be that all human beings are accountable for their sins. We'll get into the details of exactly what that argument is in the next couple of episodes. After he establishes that, yes, everyone will be held accountable for sins, that is, there's no excuse for anyone, he'll get into the solution, which is salvation by faith apart from the Mosaic Code. That's salvation by faith. And he'll prove to us out of the Old Testament. And I remember the first time I really understood what Paul was doing there. It was kind of surprising to me. He's going out of the Old Testament to prove salvation by faith. And his arguments, they caught me by surprise. And I think most people will enjoy seeing that right out of the Old Testament. Once he's shown that salvation is by faith, chapter 5, he gets into all the blessings, all the results that come out of being justified by faith. And they are really big blessings. Towards the end of that chapter, the last major blessing or result of justification by faith is this incredibly abundant forgiveness that we receive from the Father as believers. God's forgiveness is so bountiful that at the end of that chapter, that being the last thing he says there, he pauses for 2 chapters, 6 and 7, and he's going to spend those 2 chapters addressing, okay, if God's forgiveness is so bountiful, so then why not continue living in sin? Should we then continue in sin that grace may abound, is what he asks. He's bringing up a very natural objection to the blessing or the result of being justified by faith, which is, man, we are really forgiven of everything, past, present, and future. If that's the case, why not continue in sin? Well, chapters 6 and 7 get into some really technical stuff about who we are as human beings, what causes to sin, what happens when we come to faith, our relationship to sin, our relationship to the Mosaic Code. He gets into that. There's no way I want to summarize it right now. It's just too many cans of worms. And so we'll leave that for a later day. Once he's addressed that issue, why can't I continue on sinning if God is so overabundantly forgiving towards me. In the last chapter, chapter 8, he returns to those blessings of justification by faith. And with that culminating that argument is the final blessings that come with justification by faith. So that's an outline of Paul's argument or discussion here in the next 8 chapters. For us, the next couple chapters are our focus right now. And there's a few things that I need to set up for you as we go in. Ideally, I like discovering things as we go along. The problem is that it's going to get too convoluted because the argument, as you'll see, doesn't become clear to the end of chapter 4, which helps us realize what he's doing in chapter 1. So I'm going to have to give you that up front before we get into the passage itself. And hopefully you'll appreciate why I'm doing it this way. Chapters 1 and 2, again, what Paul's point is here is that we are accountable for our sin. He's not trying to prove, and when I say we, I mean humanity, right? Humanity is accountable for their sin. And the way he does it is not intuitive to an English speaker. That's because when we read the second person plural, we assume he's talking to us. And that's kind of tricky. And that's just the way we're trained in American Christianity when we read the Bible. The Bible's written to us, and we don't make a distinction that there is a difference between the Bible written for our benefit for us to learn from, and the Bible was written to specific individuals who are not us, right? So Romans was written to the Romans. And sometimes we make the mistake of assuming, oh, he's writing to us and he's talking to us. And so we'll miss very critical nuances. So let's get this all nailed down. First of all, the original audience is, of course, the Romans. But in these first 2 chapters, he's not even talking to them directly. What will happen is Paul is going to have a pretend conversation for the benefit of his audience, the Romans. He's going to be having a conversation with an imaginary, self-righteous, religious, non-Christian Jewish person. What he's going to do is in chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, he is going to be talking to this imaginary, self-righteous, religious person, and he's going to convince him. He's going to sort of slam on pagan Gentiles. And he's going to say, God is obviously angry at these people because they have failed him in this way and in that way and this way. And he's going to draw in this imaginary, self-righteous, religious Jewish person into agreeing with Paul about how doomed these pagans are and why they are ultimately doomed. As he draws in this judgmental, self-righteous, religious Jew and gets him to agree to this argument, what Paul is doing is setting up the basis of the truths that he's about to turn on the self-righteous religious person themselves. And so the way Romans chapters 1 and 2 are written, it's sort of like dragging this person in on slamming on somebody else. And as he's sucking them into like, yeah, God hates those guys. God hates those guys. Oh, they're in trouble. They're in trouble. The logic which he employs against them, God is now going to turn around and use directly on them. And so you'll see in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, so then you are without excuse. The you there cannot be us, 21st century Christians, and it cannot be the first century Roman church either. Why do I know this? Because he describes them in chapter 2. In fact, he calls them unrepentant, stubborn-hearted, storing up wrath for themselves. This can't be the same church that he just applauded, whose faith is renowned across the world. And when we read through chapter 2, it becomes evident that Paul is having this conversation with an imaginary, unrepentant Jewish person who is self-righteous and willing to accusing and condemning a pagan person. So why does Paul do it this way? Well, he's picking the 2 extremes of humanity. On one extreme, you have people who have completely given themselves over to sin and ignorant of who God is and ignorant of the Mosaic Code. He's going to address them in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, he's going to address the other extreme, which is the people of God who have studied his Torah, who have completely devoted themselves to attempting and doing their absolute best to fulfilling the Mosaic Code. And so if Paul can find a rationale for why both extremes are without excuse before God and will definitely be held accountable for their moral failures, if he can do that, then the whole spectrum of humanity is indeed in trouble. And that's exactly what's going to happen. And in fact, when we get to the second half of chapter 3, he's going to conclude saying, so then all human beings have fallen short of the glory of God. So that's the bird's eye view. So what's my takeaway? What's the setup for this? Well, you have to understand that even though he has not introduced in chapter 1 this imaginary, self-righteous, religious Jewish person, that's who he's having this pretend conversation with for the sake of his audience, so that they can learn how the argument that works against the pagan will be also applied to the religious person. And so you got to have that in mind. Okay, hopefully you do. Today we're going to get into the pagan argument, and that's going to start in chapter 1, verse 18, and it'll go all the way to 32. It's broken up into 3 sections. What Paul is going to do is he's going to show 3 different examples of proof that the Gentiles, even though they are ignorant of God in some way, will have absolutely no excuse before God for their moral failures. And because of that, will be held accountable. You'll notice from the language here that Paul's he's not trying to prove that Gentiles are guilty of sin. That's not what it is. He's not interested in doing that. What he's trying to prove is that despite their ignorance, because they have failed morally, they will be held accountable. So the question is, how can someone be held accountable and not be excused even though they're ignorant? That is the key, because why somebody can be ignorant and still be held accountable for their sin, that's the key piece of logic that's going to be turned on all of humanity. And so I want you to keep that in mind, because that's what Paul's getting into. As we go through the argument, like I said, there's 3 different examples that Paul's going to go through. There are 2 things that are happening. One is a progression. It's a progression of sin. It starts off bad, it gets worse, and it gets even worse. God is handing them over because of their lack of acknowledging God. But there's another thing happening, and that's the core logic behind it. The core logic behind humanity's inexcusability is that when we fail, we are failing at things that are self-evidently wrong. And because the things we do are self-evidently wrong, we are without excuse. Humanity is without excuse because of our actions are self-evidently wrong. Okay, so now that I've kind of preloaded you with the information you need, let's go through the argument, and we'll go verse by verse, and we'll make sure we're reading everything correctly, and hopefully just having kind of like a foreshadowing of what's happening. It's just crystal clear. So let's do it. If you don't have your Bibles open, you definitely want to have them open. You want to be following along. Verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. The first few lines, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. He's trying to say here, in our language, it would be something like, it's obvious that God is angry against ungodly, unrighteous men because they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. In what way are they suppressing truth in unrighteousness? We're going to see that fleshed out. And essentially is that pagans who don't know the Mosaic code know enough about what they're doing that it is wrong, that when they do something that's wrong, they have to suppress that amount of knowledge. So even if they don't know the Mosaic code, let's just say they commit murder, a pagan person commits murder, to the degree that they know inherently that that is wrong, when they commit that sin, they are suppressing truth in unrighteousness. There are some things that are self-evidently true. Now you're wondering, at this point, it's so early on, it probably appears that I'm just reading all this into it. What I'm reading into this verse is what follows, right? So I've read this ahead of time and I've studied, so I can look at the rest of the argument, and so I can look back and say, oh, okay, that's what he meant by this. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll be able to see the whole argument and know that's exactly what Paul is talking about here, and I'm not just making stuff up. To the extent that they know basic things about right or wrong, when they do something wrong, they are suppressing that knowledge when they commit that act. Verse 19, because that which is known about God. Now, here is the first example, okay? There are things that can be known about God and that are evident within Gentiles because God has made it evident to them. He hasn't told us just what it is yet, but his point is that there are certain things that are evident within human beings, within pagans, because God has made them evident to all human beings. What could those things be? What is it that is self-evident within humanity about God? Well, he tells us in verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. As you'll see in just a couple of verses, this is about idolatry. I'm talking about somebody goes out into the woods, cuts down a tree, brings back a rock, melts some metal, and they shape it into a cow or a donkey, and then they bow down and worship it as the creator of the forest. That's idolatry in a nutshell. Okay, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes and eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. In what way? Well, here's what we're getting at, is that to go into the forest and do that, right? To cut down a tree, carve out a person, whatever, and then bow down and worship it is clearly so self-evidently wrong that you're without excuse. The fact that the world exists means that whoever created it has to transcend it. You can't be a part of it. It does not make sense that you can create a carved image that is itself the creator of you and the forest. That is absolutely incongruent with logic. So for Paul, there are things that from the beginning of time are absolutely clear and self-evident about God. God is transcendent. He cannot be an idol. That is so self-evidently true that he concludes in verse 20 that they are without excuse. And this is the core logic that Paul wants to draw in the self-righteous religious Jew to agree with him against the pagan. And that's a very easy one for a judgmental person to agree to. Sure, of course. That's absurd that you would go and carve this statue and say, it made me. That makes no sense. So if you get to heaven and you go to God and he says, why did you make idols and worship this thing? And you say, well, I didn't know you existed. And God would say, but really? You thought that this thing that you made you? And so in that sense, it is so absurd that it is inexcusable. And that's what Paul's point is. Now, could you apply that kind of logic to all sin? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But at least for now, at least in this first example, he is picking something that is so self-evidently wrong to make this excuse where even if this was the only thing that humans did that was absolutely self-evidently true, so much so that we don't have excuse for doing it, we would still be held accountable for that one sin. Let's see it fleshed out a little more. Verse 21, for even though they knew God, to what extent did they know God? In verse 21. I'm assuming that he is talking about people that don't know anything about Yahweh. They don't know anything about about the Mosaic Code. But again, they knew God enough to know that he was not the thing they carved out. Yet they did not honor him as God or give him thanks, but instead they became futile in their speculations and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so verse 22, professing to be wise, they became fools. And what did these fools do? Verse 23, they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God. This transcendent God was changed into the form and the image in the form of corruptible, dying men and birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So this God that created the entire universe as eternal and omnipotent became this donkey, this whatever it is you want to carve. They carved beetles and they carved cats and all these mortal things and bowed down and worshiped them. And so this is the first example to prove Paul's point that human beings are willing to exchange self-evidently true things for that which is clearly a lie. There's an exchange happening. That's a key word that we'll get into later on. But there's a trade. This is exchange happening from something that is self-evidently true for something that is obviously not true. And the first exchange is that of looking at the earth. Obviously, something is evident within us that God has to be transcendent and eternal and beyond our creation. And human beings have exchanged that. Pagans have exchanged that and worshipped instead the mortal image of a corruptible man, bird, and animal. Okay, that's the first one. Now he's going to give us a second example, and that is that because of that, God has handed humanity over to homosexuality. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't think Paul is using homosexuality because he's thinking this is the worst thing that human beings can do. I don't think he's saying this is the most terrible, unforgivable sin. I think he's picking homosexuality because it is biologically self-evident. A few decades ago, gosh, I'm getting old quick. A few decades ago, there was Pastor Jerry Falwell, and he had a ghostwriter who used to write books for him, who was Reverend White, and I'm drawing a blank of his name now. And Reverend White, who was a ghostwriter and worked for Falwell, came out as gay and kept the faith, kept serving the Lord, and decided to become sort of an evangelist. And he would go to college campuses and sort of convince everybody that the New Testament did not condemn homosexuality, but that it was actually it was fine. Like the New Testament never really has a problem with it. The reason I'm bringing that up is because here's a guy who knew his Bible, was absolutely convinced that it's okay to be, that there is nothing wrong with homosexuality, that he read the New Testament and said, like, it's not addressed. And there was an interview that he gave, and he used to have this was before podcasts. It was like a radio show, and he'd have people call in, and it was about being a gay Christian man, and he would give them advice. And again, his motivations, I think, were as best as they could be for somebody who dealt with that particular sin. And what's interesting is that in giving men advice, there was he repeatedly kind of just would let these men know that, hey, there are things you have to do, even though there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. He said there are things you have to do logistically to be physically safe because your body wasn't designed this way. And that's what I'm getting at here, that even when you have the most logical educated argument for why it's okay. The most complex and convincing justification for why homosexuality is okay. At the end of the day, Reverend White had to look at just the basic physical, biological, just looking at two human beings, he could say, you weren't designed this way. And admitting that makes that sin inherently, self-evidently true, right? You can know just, but you don't have to take a course. You don't have to learn Greek. You don't have to do anything. If you don't know anything about the human species and you just take everybody's clothes off and you just see how things are supposed, you can just tell very quickly with just a very basic understanding of how all creatures work, how the two genders function, and the natural physical function between them. And so in order to justify that behavior, you would have to suppress the self-evidently true thing, which is God designed men and women to be a pair. That's his argument here. That's the reason he's picking it. Again, I don't think he's trying to say this is the worst thing in the world. I don't think he's trying to they're unforgivable or anything like that. He's just trying to say this is something that's very clearly self-evident, where even somebody who spends their entire career justifying it has to admit that there's a natural function there that can't be ignored. And so look at Paul's argument. So he says, because of their idolatry, God gave them over in verse 24 in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies may be dishonored among them. What's he talking about? Well, they exchanged the truth for a lie, and they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Verse 26, this is why, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. What does he mean by natural function? He's talking about natural biology. There's a natural biological pairing between men and women, and they exchanged the very obvious natural pairing between men and women for that which is not natural. In the same way, also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. What exactly he means receiving in their own persons the due penalty for the error, I'm not sure. There's a lot of sermons preached on that. I think he's just saying that there are physical consequences to that, and that's not critical to Paul's point here. His point is simply that there's a natural function. There's a self-evidently natural function that is exchanged when two people of the same gender pair up, because there is a very self-evidently true relationship between the two genders that should be obvious to anyone. And so when you do that, when you pair two men or two women, even if you can justify it academically, you have to exchange the self-evident nature of biology to do so. And that's exactly why Paul is picking this. When you get to heaven, you have to look God in the face and say, I didn't understand how that worked. I got that wrong. And God's going to say, really? And I don't think anybody's actually going to be able to do that, because when we get there, it's going to be we're going to be faced with the absolute brutality of the self-evident nature of our sins. And that is, there's no way. And in the end, it's going to be utterly exposed that we were just doing what we wanted to do. And we were justifying what we wanted to do. That's the second example of how humanity, the unrighteous, the sinner, is exchanging things that are self-evident for a lie, right? Well, now we're going to get into the third example. And this time, rather than picking a single thing, Paul's actually going to expand this to say this same logic can actually be applied in a much broader sense when we really take time to think about it. Verse 28. Just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. All right, here's the list. Being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. Okay, so the list, right? So again, there's a progression. This third progression is being given over now to a depraved mind to do these things. So if there is a progression and we want to go from worse to worse, I don't know if that's exactly what Paul's getting at. I don't think that's necessarily the critical thing. If that's true, then I could see why Paul is doing it, because this list starts including things that a self-righteous person could be guilty of. A self-righteous religious person might not be guilty of homosexuality and might not be guilty of idolatry, or at least convince themselves that they're not guilty of those things. But you start getting into the list, things are hitting closer to home. At first, there's things in this list that people can sort of dance around. It's like, well, I haven't committed murder. I don't hate God. And maybe you can convince yourself you're not arrogant or boastful. But we definitely start getting into things like disobedient to parents, gossip, being unloving. Okay, now we're getting into things that anybody, if anybody is the slightest bit humble enough to recognize, okay, we've all failed at some of these things. And so this list, I think, is intended to say, all right, the first two things were hitting things that a self-righteous religious person would just say, I would never do that. And then he says, so now God, these pagans are moving, right? He's still talking about they, right? Those pagans, those guys over there, they commit idolatry. Those pagans over there, they commit homosexuality, not us, right? And he says, it gets worse and worse, right? He says they do this, then they do that. And finally, they start doing things like gossiping, disobeying their parents, being unmerciful. And so I think if there's a progression, Paul is slowly hinting at this idea that the progression ends up with things that we all do. And he slowly starts sort of like tiptoeing closer and closer and turning slightly more towards the self-righteous religious person who thinks they're all that. Maybe you've done something wrong. Well, look at verse 32. He says, although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Now, you might say, a pagan person is not going to agree that when they gossip, right, when they disobey their parents, or when they're unloving or unmerciful, that they deserve death. But that's actually not true. And all I have to do is point out something that really irritates you. So let's say, for example, that you're driving around on the road and somebody cuts you off. I actually just recently had somebody pull out in front of me and brake check me with my whole family. It was just, I have 4 kids. They were all in the car with me. I tried to obey the speed limit, and this guy in this little sedan was not happy about me obeying the speed limit on, my little country road. And so he pulled out in front of me and brake checked me pretty hard, putting my family in danger. I got really upset. And I feel like most Americans, I'm sure there's some really good people out there who that doesn't irritate them. But when something like that happens, you think there's a special place in hell for that guy. And you just like, that guy needs to die. And what kind of a human being does that? What kind of sick person would do that? And there's things like that. When, sure, gossiping about somebody doesn't sound too bad until somebody's gossiping about you and says something really horrible. Well, guess what? I've been to prison, and I know people who are there for gossip, for killing gossipers. There really are. If we really take time to look at these sins when we are the ones being hurt, it's easy to see that we actually do agree that people who do these things are worthy of death. We'll recognize that these things are actually terrible. They're very evil. When we do them, we don't feel that as much. Oh, being arrogant or boastful, that's not a big deal. But when somebody's being unloving or unmerciful, judgmental, greedy, suddenly we can turn around and say like, oh, what they're doing is so sick. Who would ever do that? And so here's the problem is that we actually, to some degree, right? Pagans, to some degree, they actually know that when they practice those things, they're worthy of death. But not only do they do the same thing, when it's their friends doing it, they also give hearty approval when they practice those things. And that's the hypocrisy of humanity, is that we're able to see things that they're self-evidently wrong, and we can justify them. And in justifying them, what are we doing? We're exchanging that truth, that thing that is self-evidently true, and we're exchanging that for a lie. And because to enough of a degree, we recognize that those things are actually evil, and because we decide to do them anyway, we are without excuse before God. So as Paul is going through this argument, he's drawing in this self-righteous religious Jewish person. And this self-righteous religious person is like, amen, yup, God hates those guys. Oh, God is so angry with them, yup. Well, the self-righteous religious person, at least the way Paul was wanting to portray it, gets sucked into that. And suddenly in verse 2, chapter 1, which will be the beginning of our next episode, he turns to that self-righteous religious person and he says, so then you, for the first time, you have the second person plural. So then you, he's not talking to his audience. He's clearly having this fictional conversation with this self-righteous religious person. And we'll see that as that argument unfolds in chapter 2. If this is true about the pagans, so then you have no excuse. Every one of you who passed judgment, every one of you who agreed with me that these pagans are in for it, you are also without excuse. For in that you judge another, you condemn yourself. And I love that play on words there. In the Greek, it's the same root, krino, right? So in that krinis, you judge, you katakrinis, condemn. So to judge somebody is to look down on them, but it's not necessarily pronouncing condemnation. So when you're saying something about somebody else, you're actually condemning. You're going a step further against yourself. Why? Because you're doing the same things. And we'll get into that next week. In what way are you doing the same things? Well, that is a really interesting question. And I think you're going to really enjoy how Paul takes the logic of what he says against these pagans and he applies it to self-righteous religious people. So guess what? All human beings are sinners. You look at somebody else because they are doing something that to you is obviously wrong. Be so careful about that, because guess what? You are also doing things that are so self-evidently wrong. And in the end, we all desperately need, because we are without excuse before God. We need actual salvation in and of ourselves. We cannot do anything to save ourselves. Okay, well, that's the first bit of this argument. I hope you found it interesting. Next time we'll start in chapter 2, verse 1. And until then, Godspeed.